On the morning of March 6, 1944, something happened over the skies of Berlin that made the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany realize his air force was doomed. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into the most feared air force on earth. He had promised Adolf Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German soil. He had sworn that if a single British aircraft reached the Ruhr industrial heartland, the German people could call him Meyer instead of Göring, a German expression meaning he would eat his own words. In the early years of the war, that boast had seemed entirely justified. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland in days, shattered France in weeks, and fought the Royal Air Force to a standstill over the English Channel. But on that cold March morning, when his staff officers rushed into his headquarters with reports that American fighter planes had been spotted directly over the German capital, Göring refused to believe them. He screamed at his generals. He accused his own pilots of lying. He demanded to know how single-engine fighters could possibly fly from England to Berlin and back. The distance was over 1,100 miles. Every aviation expert in Germany had calculated that such a mission was physically impossible. A single-engine fighter simply could not carry enough fuel to fly that far and still have the weight and performance to fight. Yet the reports kept coming. Sleek silver aircraft with distinctive checkered nose markings were diving through formations of German interceptors, shooting them out of the sky with devastating precision. These were not the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts that German pilots had learned to outlast by flying deeper into the Reich. These were not the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings that could be outmaneuvered in a turning fight. These were something new, something faster, something that stayed with the American bombers all the way to the target and all the way home again. They were P-51 Mustangs. And their appearance over Berlin that day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's control of its own airspace. 2 days after the war ended in Europe, American General Carl Spaatz sat across from a defeated Hermann Göring in a schoolhouse in Augsburg, Germany. Spaatz had commanded the entire United States strategic air forces in Europe. They wanted to know exactly when Göring realized the Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies. Göring's answer was direct and specific. He told Spaatz that when American long-range fighters were able to escort bombers as far as Hanover, he knew they would soon reach Berlin. And when they did reach Berlin, he knew the results would be tragic for Germany. The word he used in that interrogation, recorded in the official United States Air Force's intelligence summary, was tragic. That single word, spoken by a broken man awaiting trial for war crimes, captured a truth that had taken the Luftwaffe completely by surprise. The Americans had done what German intelligence officers had calculated was physically impossible. They had built a single-engine fighter that could fly over 1,600 miles, engage in combat at 30,000 feet, and return home with fuel to spare. And that fighter had just rendered every assumption of German air defense obsolete in a single catastrophic morning. To understand how completely Göring failed to prepare for this moment, you need to understand the man himself. Hermann Wilhelm Göring had been a fighter ace in the First World War, credited with 22 victories. After the Red Baron was killed in April 1918, Göring eventually took command of the famous Richthofen fighter wing as its final wartime leader. He was wounded during the Munich Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 and became addicted to morphine during his painful recovery, an addiction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By 1939, Göring held more titles and more power than any Nazi leader, except Hitler himself. Reich Minister of Aviation, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan controlling the entire German economy, President of the Reichstag, Hitler's designated successor. He built an enormous art collection, much of it looted from conquered territories. He designed elaborate uniforms for himself and lived in palatial estates while his pilots died over Germany. His famous boast that no enemy bomb would fall on the Ruhr was made in September 1939 when German victory seemed inevitable. When British bombs inevitably did fall on German cities, civilians sarcastically renamed air raid sirens Meyer's trumpets. Goering reportedly once introduced himself as Meyer upon entering a Berlin air raid shelter during a bombing attack. The jest had become a bitter admission of failure. The P-51 Mustang was born from an audacious promise made in the desperate spring of 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk, but most of its equipment lay abandoned on French beaches. The Royal Air Force was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and every aircraft counted. British purchasing agents traveled to California, hoping to convince North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The P-40 was not a great aircraft, but it was available, and the British needed fighters immediately. They would take anything with guns and an engine. But James Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, had other ideas. His company had never built a fighter aircraft before. They were known for trainers and observation planes. But Kindleberger believed his engineering team could design something better than the P-40 in the same amount of time it would take to set up a licensed production line. His chief designer, a largely self-taught German-born engineer named Edgar Schmued, backed him up without hesitation. "Don't let them build an obsolete airplane," Schmued told Kindleberger. "Let us build a new one." The British Purchasing Commission was skeptical but desperate. They gave North American 120 days to deliver a flying prototype. What happened next became one of the great engineering achievements of the Second World War. Schmued and his team worked around the clock, 7 days a week. They incorporated revolutionary design features that were years ahead of contemporary fighters. The wing used a laminar flow airfoil developed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, designed to reduce drag by maintaining smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing surface. The radiator system exploited what engineers call the Meredith effect, using the heat from the cooling system to accelerate exhaust air and actually generate a small amount of thrust. The result was an aircraft with the lowest drag coefficient of any fighter in the war, just 0.0176. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the Inglewood factory on September 9, 1940. The team had completed it in somewhere between 102 and 117 days, an astonishing achievement by any standard. It flew for the first time on October 26th. The aircraft that emerged was beautiful and wickedly fast. At low altitudes, it outperformed every American fighter then in production. The Mustang Mark I was 30 miles per hour faster than the P-40 and more than 70 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mark V at 10,000 feet. Test pilots reported excellent handling and visibility. The aircraft was a joy to fly, but the original Mustang had a fatal limitation that would take 2 years to solve. Its Allison V1710 engine used a single-stage supercharger that could not deliver adequate power at high altitudes. The Allison's design worked well up to about 12,000 feet. Above 15,000 feet, performance dropped off catastrophically. By 20,000 feet, the Mustang was slower than a Messerschmitt 109 and could barely climb. The aircraft was brilliant for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, but it was useless as a high-altitude escort fighter. And high-altitude escort was the one thing the Allied bomber forces would soon need more desperately than anything else. The answer came from an unlikely source. On April 30, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a borrowed Mustang at the Royal Air Force Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. He was immediately impressed by its speed and handling at low altitude, but he noticed the same altitude limitation everyone else had seen. Above 15,000 feet, the aircraft simply fell apart in performance. But Harker was not just any test pilot. He had direct connections to the engineering division at Rolls-Royce, the company that built the legendary Merlin engine. Within 48 hours of his test flight, he had contacted the company's experimental department with a radical proposal. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that was transforming the Spitfire Mark IX into a high-altitude champion? It produced over 1,300 horsepower and maintained that power at altitudes where the Allison was gasping for air. Ernest Hives, the general manager of Rolls-Royce, authorized the conversion immediately. The first modified aircraft flew on October 13, 1942, just 5 months after Harker's original test flight. The transformation was almost beyond belief. The Merlin-powered Mustang achieved 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, faster than any production fighter then in service with any Air Force. Its service ceiling jumped above 40,000 feet. Where the Allison Mustang had struggled, the Merlin Mustang soared. One American champion deserves particular credit for pushing the Merlin Mustang program forward against bureaucratic resistance. Major Thomas Hitchcock, Jr. served as the United States Assistant Military Air Attaché in London, a World War I fighter ace, a world-famous polo player, and a man with political connections that reached into the highest levels of the American government. When General Henry Arnold dismissed the British test data, Hitchcock went over his head, writing directly to the Assistant Secretary of War for Air. His letter included a prophetic observation. Sired by the English out of an American mother, the Mustang has no parent in the Army Air Corps to appreciate and push its good points. Hitchcock was killed on April 19, 1944, testing a Mustang in a high-speed dive over Salisbury, England, just weeks before D-Day. He never saw the victory he helped make possible. Even the Merlin engine was not enough to solve the escort problem completely. The Mustang needed range, enormous range, enough to fly from England to Berlin and back while still having fuel for extended combat. North American engineers realized that the heavier Merlin engine had shifted the aircraft's center of gravity, creating space for an additional fuel tank behind the pilot's seat. They designed an 85-gallon tank that fit into the fuselage, increasing internal fuel capacity by 46%. The fuselage tank came with serious handling penalties. When full, it made the Mustang dangerously unstable, what pilots described as nothing resembling an airplane. The center of gravity shifted so far aft that the aircraft could snap into an uncontrollable spin with little warning. Standard operating procedure required burning down the fuselage tank first, then switching to external drop tanks, aiming to have no more than 40 gallons remaining in the fuselage when combat was expected. The external drop tanks were another critical innovation. American officers in the 8th Air Force developed a design for compressed paper drop tanks that were lighter and cheaper than metal tanks. Experts at Wright Field had declared paper tanks absolutely unfeasible, but by the time their report reached England, the 8th Air Force had already used over 15,000 of them without a single structural failure. With two 108-gallon drop tanks added to full internal fuel, the P-51D carried nearly 490 gallons and could fly over 1,600 miles. A P-47 Thunderbolt burned approximately 260 gallons over 600 miles. The Mustang covered the same distance on 108 gallons. The long-range escort fighter the Luftwaffe had declared physically impossible existed. It was operational, and it was about to be pointed at Berlin. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany had reached a crisis that threatened to end strategic bombing altogether. The doctrine that the bomber will always get through had been an article of faith among American air planners since the early 1930s. Instructors taught that formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to any target without fighter escort. The bombers would defend themselves with interlocking fields of fire from their multiple gun positions. Enemy fighters that attacked the formation would be shot down faster than they could shoot down bombers. This doctrine was built on assumptions that combat would prove catastrophically wrong. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses in a double strike against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. P-47 Thunderbolts and British Spitfires could escort the bombers only as far as the Belgian border, roughly 400 miles from England. Beyond that, the B-17S were on their own for more than 2 hours over heavily defended German territory. Bomber crews called it the beginning of hell. The result was a slaughter. German fighters assembled in force just beyond the escort boundary and attacked the undefended bomber formations with 20mm cannon fire and rockets. 60 B-17S were shot down in a single day. More than 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. 2 months later, on October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt. The date would become known as Black Thursday. 291 B-17S attacked the ball-bearing works. German fighters rose in even greater numbers. 60 bombers were shot down outright over Germany. 17 more were scrapped after landing in England. 121 additional aircraft required major repairs. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force had effectively lost 200 aircraft, nearly 70% of the attacking force either destroyed or damaged. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 of their 16 aircraft. 130 men from a single bomb group, 87% of the force they had launched that morning, were gone within hours. The 8th Air Force's own official history later acknowledged the brutal reality. The Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. The mathematics were merciless. At a sustainable loss rate of 5% per mission, bomber crews had roughly a 28% statistical chance of completing their required 25-mission combat tour. At the 16 to 26% loss rates of the Schweinfurt missions, no crew could statistically survive. The 8th Air Force would ultimately lose more than 26,000 men killed in action over Europe, a total that exceeded the combat deaths of the entire United States Marine Corps throughout the Pacific War. After Black Thursday, unescorted deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended for nearly 5 months. While American bomber crews were dying over Germany, Adolf Galland, appointed General of Fighters in November 1941 at the age of 29, was trying desperately to warn the Luftwaffe High Command about the long-range escort threat. He understood immediately that P-51s would change everything. But when Galland tried to sound the alarm, he ran into a wall of denial from Goering himself. The official position handed down from the top was that long-range single-engine fighters were technically impossible. American fighters might appear over the Western Reich temporarily, but they could not possibly escort bombers all the way to Berlin. The physics simply did not allow it. When Galland reported that American fighters had been shot down over Aachen, deep inside German territory, Goering summoned him to a train station and screamed at him in front of other officers. "I officially give you an order that they were not there," Goering bellowed. "Do you understand me? The American fighters were not there." Galland pointed out calmly that the wreckage of the shot-down American aircraft was physical proof they had been there. The debris was lying on German soil. German soldiers had examined the aircraft. The pilots had been captured. Goering suggested, apparently seriously, that perhaps the American fighters had been hit farther west and then glided east into Germany before crashing. Galland's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Glided to the east, sir?" The exchange captured the delusional thinking that left the Luftwaffe unable to prepare for the long-range escort threat until it was too late to respond effectively. In January 1944, 3 interconnected changes occurred that would transform the air war over Europe within a matter of months. First, General James Doolittle replaced Ira Eaker as commander of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was already famous throughout America for leading the first air raid on Tokyo in April 1942. He brought a fundamentally different philosophy to the bomber escort problem. Visiting 8th Fighter Command headquarters shortly after taking command, Doolittle noticed a sign on the wall that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." The sign reflected the defensive mentality that had governed fighter operations since the bombing campaign began. Fighters were to stay close to the bombers, protecting them from German attackers. Doolittle ordered the sign torn down immediately. In its place, he put a new sign with new orders. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. Major General William Kepner, the 8th Fighter Command Chief, was overjoyed. He had argued for years that fighters should be freed to hunt German aircraft aggressively rather than being tied to slow-moving bomber formations. He reportedly ripped down the old sign himself as Doolittle walked out of the room. Doolittle later called this change the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the entire war. Second, growing numbers of Merlin-powered P-51 Mustangs began arriving at English bases. Third, Doolittle freed the fighters from their defensive close escort role entirely. Instead of flying formation alongside the bombers, Mustangs could now range ahead of the bomber stream, hunting German fighters at altitude, diving down to strafe airfields and railway lines, and engaging the enemy wherever they could find them. The bombers, in effect, became bait in a deliberate trap. German fighters that rose to attack the bomber formations would find American fighters waiting for them with advantages of altitude and surprise. The test of this new aggressive doctrine proved its worth during Big Week in late February 1944, when nearly 100 German fighter pilots were killed in just 6 days, roughly 15% of the entire day fighter force. But it was March 6, 1944, that truly mattered. The 8th Air Force launched 812 heavy bombers against 3 industrial targets around Berlin. Fighter escort exceeded 800 aircraft, including 100 P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had against the attacking Americans. 69 bombers were shot down, the highest single-day loss for the 8th Air Force in the entire European war. The cost was severe, but the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. P-51 pilots alone claimed 43 German aircraft destroyed. One particular action from that day illustrates what made the Mustang so devastating when flown aggressively. The 357th Fighter Group approached Berlin from the wrong direction due to a navigation error in poor weather, coming from the east rather than the west, from the direction of Poland rather than England. This accidental mistake placed 33 Mustangs directly behind a massive German fighter formation. More than 120 Luftwaffe aircraft were assembling east of Berlin, focused entirely on the bomber stream ahead of them. They never expected American fighters to appear from behind. Major Tommy Hayes ordered his pilots to attack immediately. The Mustangs dove into the German formations from dead astern, the perfect position for an ambush. The German pilots never knew what hit them. In the running battle that followed, the 33 American fighters destroyed 20 German aircraft. They did not lose a single Mustang. Captain Clarence Anderson, who would become a triple ace with more than 16 confirmed victories, was among the pilots who fought that day. He passed away in May 2024 at the age of 102, one of the final living links to that desperate spring. After the massacre of March 6th, the Luftwaffe never again used Messerschmitt 110 night fighters in daylight attacks against 8th Air Force bomber formations. The Berlin missions of early March 1944 initiated a death spiral from which the Luftwaffe never recovered. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 20% of its experienced fighter pilots and 56% of its available fighter aircraft. April was catastrophic beyond anything German planners had anticipated. 489 fighter pilots were killed in a single month, fully 25% of the entire German day fighter force. Training programs produced only 396 replacement pilots during the same period. Between January and June of 1944, 2,262 German fighter pilots died in combat. In just 5 months, the Luftwaffe effectively lost 100% of its day fighter force. The entire establishment of experienced pilots was killed and replaced, in some units multiple times, by progressively less capable replacements rushed through abbreviated training. The great paradox was that German fighter production actually increased dramatically throughout 1944. Albert Speer's factory dispersal program pushed total aircraft production to more than 40,000 units for the year. Germany had plenty of aircraft. What Germany did not have was pilots capable of flying them effectively in combat. Average training hours for new German fighter pilots dropped from 240 hours in 1942 to just 110 hours by 1944. American replacement pilots received between 225 and 350 hours of flight training before entering combat. By July 1944, with rare exceptions, only group and squadron commanders in Luftwaffe fighter units had more than 6 months of combat experience. The majority of German pilots had served somewhere between 8 and 30 days before being killed. The oil campaign that began in May 1944 sealed the Luftwaffe's fate permanently. American bombers systematically targeted Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities. Production collapsed from 92,000 barrels per day to just 5,000 barrels by September 1944. By February 1945, German aviation fuel production stood at half of 1% of early 1944 levels. Hundreds of brand-new aircraft sat on dispersal fields throughout Germany with no fuel in their tanks and no qualified pilots to fly them. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the transformation of the air war was complete. The Allies flew 14,674 combat sorties over Normandy and the English Channel on the first day of the invasion. Luftflotte 3, the German air command responsible for France, managed approximately 320 sorties in response. The ratio was 46-1. General Eisenhower had told his troops on the eve of invasion that if they saw fighter aircraft overhead, those aircraft would be Allied aircraft. He was confident enough in American and British air superiority to stake the success of the entire operation on that promise. German soldiers developed their own bitter joke about the situation. American planes are gray, they said, British planes are black, and Luftwaffe planes are invisible. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not caused by any single factor. It resulted from a convergence of engineering innovation, doctrinal revolution, industrial might, and the cold mathematics of attrition warfare. But the P-51 Mustang was the essential instrument that made everything else possible. German ace Günther Rau, who scored 275 aerial victories and survived the war, flew a captured P-51 after Germany's surrender and later praised its combination of speed, maneuverability, climb rate, and extraordinary range. What struck him most was how straightforward the aircraft was to fly compared to the German fighters he had mastered. Hermann Göring lived long enough to face justice at Nuremberg. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. On the night before his scheduled execution in October 1946, he killed himself with a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell. He escaped the hangman, but not the verdict of history. Adolf Galland survived the war despite his conflicts with Goering and the Nazi High Command. after being relieved of his position as General of Fighters in January 1945 for criticizing Luftwaffe leadership too openly. He was allowed to form an elite jet fighter unit flying Messerschmitt 262 jets during the war's final months. He died in February 1996 at the age of 83, having outlived nearly all of his wartime adversaries and comrades alike. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who oversaw German aircraft production, provided the most direct epitaph for the Luftwaffe after the war. "The British left us with deep and bleeding wounds," he acknowledged, "but the Americans stabbed us in the heart." The story of the Mustangs over Berlin is fundamentally a story about how organizations respond when reality contradicts their assumptions. Goering denied reality, issuing official orders that American fighters were not there even as their wreckage accumulated on German soil. Doolittle accepted reality, changing tactics within weeks of taking command. The gap between those two approaches decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. When Goering told his American interrogators that the appearance of long-range fighters over Berlin meant the results would be tragic for Germany, he was finally admitting what he had spent more than a year refusing to believe. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated by superior numbers alone. It had been defeated by an aircraft German experts said could not exist, flown by pilots using tactics no one had anticipated, in a battle for air superiority that Germany did not realize had begun until it was already lost. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button. Subscribe to World War Declassified for new videos every week, the stories they never put in the textbooks. Thank you for watching.